All right. Peace, peace. All right. Today is October 9th, 2023. And what I wanted to do was do a piece on what they call so-called Columbus Day, which is now Indigenous Peoples Day. And the reason why I want to do a video on this is because here on the Oneness Realize on T.O.R is just bringing everything into oneness to a better understanding of, in the situation that we find ourselves in here in 2023, everything from spiritual, religious aspect, or, we talk about God a lot on this, the origins, the character of God, and, the different spiritual teachings across the globe and how they align. Now, the doctrine of discovery, which came out of what they call 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And under the doctrine of discovery and the papal bulls decreed by, the Catholic Church or Rome, and justified them so-called discovering so-called new lands that indigenous peoples were already on. And a lot of people say, well, how do you discover something where people already were? I don't think some people don't really have the information or the knowledge about the doctrine of discovery. So in this piece, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a couple videos. I'm going to also, just add my little 2 cents in, and hopefully this will be an insightful video on, what they call so-called Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. Um, you know, some people, I'm not trying to tell you to celebrate it or anything like that, just bringing awareness to it because we've all been affected, whether we realize it or not. And me, um, coming up in the community and family line that I came up in, um, it's like people kind of try to separate themselves from indigenous peoples, and they kind of look at it from the outside, looking from the outside, looking in at another group, when in actuality, the information I'm going to show you is how we all been affected, whether you call yourself an African American, whether you call yourself Native American, whatever you call yourself, we have been affected. And because this was a global doctrine that, the European powers used to go and justify taking other people's lands, and how they used to label people savages and uncivilized, and those who needed to be saved because they needed help because they were not Christian. So they used this to usurp, take lands, colonize lands all across the planet of people who they deemed themselves as the spiritual or religious power, and they kind of took their empire, what they formed as the official word of God, to colonize the planet. And we talk about Columbus too. As more information is coming out, we're living in the information age. There's different perspectives of who Christopher Colombo, who he was, what he looked like. And through my understanding of that, I don't want to go too far in that. Yes, he probably didn't look like what we think he looks like now. They showed his picture. Most likely he was, I'm not gonna say fully dark skinned, but he probably wasn't as European as you think he looks. And that's a whole nother story. We've had conversations. I can show you different resources and things about who he was, and what had actually happened. But I'm not going to go that deep into it. But what I'm going to do is share these videos, and hopefully they will be insightful. So let me share the first one.
What if I told you that the Vatican helped Europe colonize the world, that it justified European colonialism in the name of spreading Christianity, that there are papal decrees that allowed European empires to take over entire countries? And for what? to allow colonizers to subjugate people, to take away their lands, wage war on their cultures, impose a self-conceived notion of racial superiority over them. And all of this just because the colonizers claimed that they were the ones who discovered new lands. So they had a right to rule over those new lands. Now, the Vatican has come forward and apologized for what it did. It has apologized for helping the colonizers. Here's a report.
Have you heard something called the Doctrine of Discovery? It's Europe's version of finders, keepers. It's what European colonizers used to subjugate the world. The doctrine was cited by Europeans who discovered new lands, and the doctrine traces its roots back to the Vatican and to the Catholic Church. Now the Church has apologized for helping colonizers in their conquests. On Thursday, the Vatican issued an unprecedented statement. It officially apologized for its historical role in justifying colonialism by European powers. The Vatican said, "The Roman Catholic Church repudiates those concepts that fail to recognize the inherent human rights of indigenous peoples, including what has become known as the legal and political doctrine of discovery." It also declared that the doctrine is not part of the Christian's faith, but the Vatican is centuries late. The doctrine of discovery is a concept laid out in the so-called papal bulls. What are these? These are usually official statements from the head of the Catholic Church. That would be the Pope. So no less than the popes were involved in justifying European colonialism. Their decrees were used extensively in the conquest of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Africa, and the United States. The colonizers claimed that they had the approval of the church to have sovereignty, property, and commercial rights in lands they discovered. Here's an example. Papal decrees in the 15th century permitted Portugal to subjugate Muslims and the non-Christians in Africa. That's not even the ugliest part of these decrees. The Vatican was quite explicit when it came to who Europe could colonize. It could only be non-Christians. So colonialism was essentially used as a tool by the Vatican to spread Christianity across the world. And the colonized countries paid a huge price. Take Canada, for instance. Between the 19th and the 20th centuries, more than 150,000 indigenous children were taken hostage in Canada. They were snatched away from their families and lodged against their will in the re-education institutions. Here, they were subjected to unspeakable atrocities. They were physically assaulted and sexually abused. Many of them didn't survive. They were buried in mass graves that are still being discovered in Canada. Last year, Pope Francis visited Canada. He apologized to the indigenous people for what the Vatican put them through. In 2015, too, the Pope apologized for the Catholic Church's action in Bolivia. He sought forgiveness not only for the offenses of the Church, but also for the crimes committed against the native people during the so-called conquest of America. Just so you know, European colonism was a vast and often very violent project. The whole world at some point or the other has been under the control of a European power. Look at the French Empire. It ruled over territory greater than the size of the Europe itself. Then there was the British Empire, the most notorious of them all. And its peak was about 25% of the world population was a subject of the British Empire. Apologies are welcome and long overdue. But preparations will be the closest they'll come to making amends.
Garbage time. That phrase never sounded quite right.
All right. All right. So in that clip, they were talking about the doctrine of discovery. And just on a few notes on that, excuse me. Yeah, so in that video, they went into a few things. And, just like last year, 2 years ago, in the recent year, last year too, the Vatican came out and they repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And in the clip, they talked about racial superiority. And this is their claim that, not only was it religion, if you were Christian, you were deemed, uncivilized. If you were not Christian, you were deemed uncivilized, a savage. And how this psychology followed into it led into the what we would call racial classifications to justify, people being less intelligent, less human, subhuman, sub-Saharan African. So whenever you hear that word and that term sub-Saharan, that means below human, sub-Saharan. I know it's like a desert. It sounds like a desert to you, but anytime they use these terms, they're talking about something below or under, below or under or not human. So through all of these racial superiority class systems, caste systems, they came into so-called Black, Negro, color, and they adopted the status of white. And I did a video on more Black and white a couple of weeks ago, and it just went in to show you, to give you a larger glimpse on how that is used here in the United States. So from the doctrine of discovery spilled out this racial superiority complex throughout the planet, and it denationalized indigenous people. Now, some indigenous tribes here are still recognized by the federal government. They may belong to tribes, and the tribes that they showed on these clips. But there are many, many millions of indigenous people that are still here, who are still fighting for their rights, or know that they are indigenous to these lands, because we are, I am an indigenous person, as it told you by the clip. We are indigenous peoples. They're not just talking about the United States when we talk about Indigenous Peoples Day. They are talking about, in the video, they said Canada, US, the US, Australia, and also Africa. So a lot of so-called Black people, so-called African American people, they kind of look from the outside in on these things, thinking, oh yeah, it's a shame what they did to the Native Americans. Now, I'm not telling anybody to be a victim. I'm not telling anybody, to be all emotional in your feelings, but to just know that this affected the whole planet, and you are an indigenous person. So whether you came here on a slave ship, if you think that, or if you were already here, or wherever you were at on the planet, your ancestors they were indigenous people. And once that they were put in these racial classes, called savages, which savages and uncivilized, which just basically turned into second-class citizens in, a larger scheme of things. We are all descendants. Well, I wouldn't say descendants. We are all living ascendants of, these ancestors. I try to correct my language. We don't descend. We are living ascendants from, our ancestors and those people, because I think that's part of breaking the spell too. I mean, we just really don't understand the words we use. And sometimes I may use something that, I know the context of what I'm trying to say, but when you actually do the etymology of a word, and you look back on it, and it's like, what are you really saying? And it's like you're putting yourself in a spell yourself by the words you use. Words are very, very powerful. And in the book and in the Bible, it talks about sorcery. Like, we're still under this sorcery of being called out of our names and not realizing how this stuff still affects us. So if it's repudiated, if the Vatican has repudiated this already, they've already repudiated their own doctrine. And I'm not saying that further steps don't need to be taken. I believe that there's still a lot of corrections and healing and repair, or reparations, that still need to be paid on the planet. But I believe in this time that people are making these things aware, and they are happening slowly but naturally. The reparations, the repairing is happening, whether that's what you think is monetarily happening, whether you think that is spiritually happening. I think the Most High, the source, Mother Earth, or whatever you want to call the collective consciousness, or the collective energy of what we call the source, is working. They're trying, the planet is trying to rid itself of certain mistakes and certain consciousnesses, lower vibration consciousnesses with the age of information, but it's up to the people. So I think it is very important that people understand if the Vatican has repudiated the doctrine of discovery, that's everything that comes with it. You don't have to call yourself, a label. You don't have to. You can reunite with your tribe, let's say, your tribe, your clan, your nation. But we as people have to want to do that and to connect, and we have to see the benefits or the necessary need to do that. A lot of people don't see that. And I'm not here to, like I said, I'm not here to be a victim, but I don't really think people really understand the importance of what is being shown in these clips. Like, we all know that it was wrong, but it was justified legally as they were the so-called word of God. And they said in the video, the so-called conquest. So even they're using the word, the so-called, because in reality, what it was illegal. You know what I'm saying? It was illegal to enslave people. Now, if you say that you're a slave and you use that terminology and you look at it, instead of saying, well, you were a prisoner of war or you were kidnapped, it has a whole different meaning. So if you're saying you're a slave, you're kind of agreeing with the doctrine of the discovery. If you're saying you're a descendant of a slave and you're all of these things, it's sorcery. So you got to understand the words that you're using. And when, what I'm saying, when people go to the table and they understand where they went wrong and then they come together in the power of truth, then things will change. So I'm not sitting here trying to say, yeah, we need reparations. We need that. Some people are for it. Some people are against it, or some people don't understand the situation that we're really, 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 really in. So if you're saying that you're a descendant of a slave, okay, you're agreeing with the doctrine of discovery. But if you're saying that your people were kidnapped, that you were a prisoner of war, and that you are not these things that they labeled you, and you come from a tribe, a nation, and you have your own divine connection with the source, and you believe in that knowledge and trying to live and striving to live that knowledge, then you are refusing to fall under that sorcery. Even if you think you're saying something or you think you have an understanding, you are correcting what we were not educated about. So, I just wanted to go into that one here, and I'm going to do another one and it talks about the African continents, how the doctrine of discovery affected the African continents.
Welcome to Global Black History. Today we are focusing on the doctrine of discovery, why Africans don't own their land. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel. The doctrine of discovery, a forgotten yet impactful concept, shaped colonization and inflicted injustices on indigenous peoples in various parts of the world, including in Africa. The doctrine of discovery originated in Europe and was used to justify the subjugation and dispossession of native populations. The doctrine of discovery granted explorers the divine right to claim and govern discovered lands outside Christian realms. It fueled economic exploitation, as resources were extracted for the wealth of colonial powers. Indigenous populations faced forced labor and displacement. But does this doctrine hold relevance in a world striving for justice and equality? It absolved Europeans and Westerners from any responsibility in stealing and dispossessing non-Europeans by giving the discovering nation title to that territory against all other European nations. What is the doctrine of discovery? The doctrine of discovery refers to a series of papal bulls and legal principles originating in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. These decrees, notably the papal bulls issued by Pope Alexander VI in the late 15th century, granted European explorers and colonizers the right to claim and govern lands they discovered outside of Christian jurisdictions. It essentially justified the dispossession of indigenous peoples' lands and the assertion of European dominance over these territories. This is why you will find the Catholic Church never objected to taking land from Africans which they used to build their churches, schools, and hospitals. Up to this day, most land occupied by the Catholic Church was not paid for but taken forcefully. The doctrine of discovery was developed primarily by European powers during the era of exploration. Spain and Portugal, being at the forefront of overseas expansion, played a significant role in formulating and implementing this doctrine. The papal bulls issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, particularly the bull Inter Caetera, legitimized Spain's claims to the lands discovered by Christopher Columbus and subsequent explorers. The purpose of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery served multiple purposes. First and foremost, it provided a legal and moral framework for European powers to assert their dominance and ownership over newly discovered territories. By deeming non-Christian lands as terra nullius or empty lands, they justified the dispossession of indigenous peoples and the colonization of their lands. Additionally, the doctrine aimed to spread the influence of the Catholic Church. Economic impact of the doctrine of discovery. The economic impact of the doctrine of discovery cannot be overstated. European powers exploited the lands they claimed under this doctrine, extracting valuable resources and establishing lucrative trade networks. This economic exploitation was often accompanied by the displacement, enslavement, and forced labor of indigenous populations. The wealth accumulated through these colonial ventures fueled the growth of European empires and laid the foundation for the modern global economy. Under the doctrine of discovery, European powers claimed ownership and control over vast territories, often rich in valuable natural resources. This led to the exploitation and extraction of resources such as minerals, timber, furs, and agricultural products. Indigenous lands were stripped of their resources, often without proper compensation or benefit to the original inhabitants. The economic exploitation of these resources contributed to the wealth and development of the colonial powers. The doctrine of discovery facilitated the establishment of extensive trade networks between Europe and the newly colonized territories. European powers sought to maximize their economic gains by establishing monopolies and controlling the flow of goods. Indigenous peoples were often forced into unfavorable trade agreements, resulting in the loss of autonomy and economic self-sufficiency. The trade networks built on the foundation of the doctrine of discovery further enriched the colonizers while disadvantaging indigenous communities, non-European communities. The economic impact of the doctrine of discovery was also manifested through forced labor practices and the displacement of indigenous populations. Many indigenous peoples were subjected to enslavement, indentured servitude, or coerced labor on plantations, mines, and other exploitative enterprises. The forced displacement of indigenous communities from their ancestral lands disrupted their economics, were stripped of their resources.
All right, I wanted to go back to a certain point here. This is the bull Inter Caetera. It says, Alexander the bishop, servant of the servants of God, to the illustrious sovereigns, our very dear son in Christ, Ferdinand King, and our very dear in Christ Isabella, Queen of Castile, Leon, Aragon, Sicily, and Granada. Health and apostolic benediction, among other works well pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart. This assuredly ranks the highest, that in our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion, be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. Wherefore, in so as much by the favor of divine elemency, we, though of insufficient merits, have been called to this holy see of Peter. Now, this is the bull Inter Caetera. And as you can see, this is justifying and showing you the psychology or the workings of the doctrine of discovery through the papal bulls coming from the Pope, coming from, the head of the church. And it says, I wanted to go down here in the memory. It says, name in your recovery of the kingdom of Granada from the yoke of the Saracens. So they're talking about the Moors in this one. Saracens were considered Moors. Some of the Arabs Moors, or which you would see Arabs, but they're talking about the Arabs or the Moors, combination of both. We therefore are rightly led and hold it as our duty to grant you even of our own accord and in your favor these things whereby with effort each day more hearty you may be enabled for the honor of God himself and spread of the Christian rule. So it's just telling you what's behind and in these documents, the conquest, the so-called conquest. This was an extension of what we would call the Crusades. The Crusades was a war between the Catholic Church and the Moors, or the Saracens, or the Arabs, which, where the Moors had ruled Spain for 700 years. Different factions of Moors, or then Arabs came into that as well. These were people of African descent, and then some came who were of, amalgamated, mixed Arab blood, Moorish blood. Now, I'm not saying this to give you a boastful, I'm just giving you a historical reference on where these things come from. And there's a whole history. I shared a book, when I was talking about, the Moors in Spain. And this is an outgrowth. The discovery of America is an outgrowth of the defeat of the Moors. So they assumed these trading routes all across the Atlantic Ocean and, to different areas. And these Moorish people who were in control of those routes were, slowly dethroned. Some converted to Christianity just to save their lives, their possessions. Some fought, some moved across back into Africa, some moved over into the Americas, some went further into Europe and other places because there were already Moors or different people there. So I'm just giving you a solid foundation on where you start. Like, if you wonder how we got here in the United States to this racial superiority, to all of this injustice and stuff, it stems from the Crusades. Some people say the Crusades never ended. So in that case, us being labeled, taken out of, being denationalized, is the ultimate effect of the doctrine of discovery. Now, in this piece, they were talking about, you would see the signs. It says, rescind the doctrine of discovery. They repudiated it. Now, this is what I'm talking about, language. The Vatican repudiated the doctrine of discovery. They didn't rescind it. So we're talking about definitions, language, and I'm talking about, and I was talking about earlier, like, we don't understand the words we use. So they're coming out and they're apologizing for something. But the indigenous tribes, or the indigenous people who are in law, who have lawyers who, understand their situation, and saying, no, don't repudiate it, rescind it. So when you hear somebody saying, no, I'm not this, I'm that, or I'm not this, you can't label me this, because they know if I agree with this, then I'm just saying I agree with the doctrine. You know what I'm saying? The doctrine of discovery. And people don't understand language, law, history. They don't understand. They don't understand these things. And we are slowly waking up to these things, because we're in the information age. So rescind, I'm going to give you the definition of rescind. Rescind is to revoke, cancel, repeal a law, or order, or agreement. So that would call for, if the Vatican rescinded the doctrine of discovery, now we can talk about the repairing. We can talk about, the reparations, or the repairing, or the lands, being maybe I'm going to say transfer, but land rights and things like that. That's what they're getting into. They're getting into the reparations, and they're like, no, don't repudiate, rescind the doctrine of discovery. So I'm just trying to give you the levels of language, which I'm still trying to understand because I'm trying to correct myself. Things I call myself, things I think about other people, and the words that I use on a daily basis, to try to correct that. So something we must understand. Sometimes we say understand, not really understanding something. So we don't want to be under something, we want to have it inner. And I'm guilty of using that understand word all the time, trying to understand these things and really take them to heart. So what does repudiate mean? Refuse to accept or be associated with. So they repudiated it. So basically they're refusing to accept or to be associated with. So they're apologizing and they say they don't want to be they don't want to be associated with that anymore. And they're sorry for what they did, but they haven't rescinded it. So there you go. That's law right there for you. That's law. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but there's a whole bunch of jargon and words that are used in the courtroom or in legal situations, and you can see repudiate, rescind, repudiate, rescind, repudiate, rescind. Somebody's telling you something, well, and you're like, no, I don't want you to say that. I want this, and they're kind of just like, no, I'm sorry, but it's been repudiated. I'm sorry. I don't want to, but no, I want you to rescind it. No, okay, we just got to continue to come back to the table to negotiate. So that's an ongoing process for a lot of the indigenous peoples around the planet. Now, you go into Africa right now, and if you pay attention to the news, what's going on, there's a lot of strife. There's a lot of colonizing powers being kicked out of certain countries. So this is alive, well, in today. It has never stopped, and it's still going on. So a lot of African countries, the French, British, and some of these powers, it was something going on in Ghana. I think Ghana was it Niger, and Niger, I believe, if you go and pay attention what's going on in Niger, in some places, they are concerned, and some people in what was it, Ghana, who had allied, with the United States, they're asking the United States for help because some of these tribes and countries are saying, they've had enough of being exploited and not being compensated, and the resources being taken from the land, and the indigenous people and populations and tribal populations are being exploited, enslaved in some cases, and they're tired of it. So that is still going on around the world today. So that is the doctrine of discovery here. So I just wanted to share that video with you. Hopefully it was insightful, as we continue to heal as people, as a nation, as humanity, for lack of better words. And all you could do is just do your best in the Most High to live your truth and to continue to grow in understanding. And hopefully this video would be able to help somebody understand the doctrine of discovery. When they say they discovered America, what does that really mean? Just share something else here, all right, before I go. And this is from the United Nations, and it just talks about how the doctrine of discovery basically talked about how indigenous peoples were savages, barbarians, inferior, uncivilized, and among other constructs, the colonizers used to subjugate, dominate, exploit the lands, territories, resources of native, or I would say indigenous peoples. And that's another thing when we say native. Some people don't like to be called native. Like, this is an ongoing thing with these words in this legal jargon: native, indigenous, autochthonous, from the soil, what they call aboriginal. All of these terms, in law have been used on a global stage, and certain people reject them because they're saying, no, everybody's native. I'm native to where I'm born. You know what I'm saying? What is a Native American? Like, what is that? What is indigenous American? Autochthonous. I always have a hard time saying autochthonous, which means from the dirt, from the soil. Aboriginal, some people say Aboriginal. And if you see all these arguments online too, that a lot of indigenous people here are having, what do we call ourselves? Like, we're in those stages of people, their knowledge is out there. It's just that people don't have the full legal understanding of what these things, or they think they do, and so this group thinks that they have the right word or the right way to go about it, and they want to reject this, when all of them are, pieces to the picture, but sometimes the ego gets in the way, and that's why some people say that so-called Black people can't, saying unite under, one common theme, because of the ego and not understanding how they need every faction of society to come into an understanding and awareness of the truth and one common thing. And my thing is, one common thing for me is that, I am not a color. I am not a object. I am not a Negro, colored, Black, African American, all of these things that they said I am. I come from a heritage, a long line, a heritage of great people, some who have done great things, some who have done not so great things. I am not sub-Saharan African. I am not sub-Saharan. I'm not these things that they say that we are. So that's just a continual, if we can just, I think if people could just understand that, and then work on, okay, well, what do we call ourselves, or what direction we go, that would be a step in the right direction. But, so much money being made off of these labels, I understand why people, I understand, or I see it, why it is so difficult, because there's a lot of incentives, there's a lot of ties, there's a lot of information being pumped around with these titles and labels that attract people who, let's say, what they call the 85%, 10%, 5%, the 10%, the blood, the blood suckers of the poor, to keep them ignorant. Well, I understand all of that. So this is just something, I was going to go into another rant, but that is just the honest observation that, I see. But with that, this is the Doctrine of Discovery. I hope you learned something, but until then, peace.